Hello, this is YM of Lavender Kitchen Sink Collective, and I wanted to talk to you. This is piggybacking to follow up on a video that the second video that I posted last week about where I see my place in the movement. And one of the things that I feel like, as someone who is basically a historian, I have a undergraduate degree in history. And history kind of infuses all of the work that I do. I feel like it's really one of my roles in the movement is to ground our work, Black LGBTQ liberation work, in history, in economic and political reality. And so I'm going to talk about um, Black people, specifically African Americans, because that is my own background. I'm an African American from the southern United States, the former Confederate, which was part of the former Confederate States of America. Born and raised in North Carolina, born and raised in the South. And I'm going to talk about African Americans and our how cissexism, excuse me, patriarchy and gender are constructed within our community. And that's very important for those of us who do any kind of gender liberation work as feminist, as womanist, as transgender, same gender loving, lesbian, gay, asexual, identified folks who do this work around the world, but particularly in the United States. It's very important to understand how colonialism, how white supremacy shape our understandings of gender. In a country like the United States, now we know patriarchy can be in any culture. There's a lot of debate of when patriarchy first developed among anthropologists, among feminists, when patriarchy first developed as a system of social organization and a system of social and political hegemony. As far as the United States goes, patriarchy, cissexism in our culture is rooted in British colonialism. And British colonialism is where African American gender identity and African American gender roles are constructed. And now when I say that, you may get confused. You would say, well, sexuality is inherent to humans because humans are primates and humans are animals, and so all humans have a sexuality because all primates and all animals have a sexuality. Well, I'm not talking about sexuality in terms of the procreation, the desire to procreate, the desire for sexual pleasure. That's not what I mean when I say sexuality. I'm talking about the construction of sex and sexuality and gender as we understand it within human societies. That's what I'm talking about. And in this society, the United States, which was a British colony, where British colonizers stolen, they fought indigenous people. A lot of European powers on this soil fought indigenous people to take over this land. But here on the East Coast, what we now call the Eastern United States, and that includes the U.S. South where I live, British colonizers took over indigenous, First Nations land. This land where I'm at is traditionally Cherokee, Eno, Occaneechi land. And the British took over this land, and they brought, they trafficked, enslaved people from Africa to work this land, and that's my people, African Americans, people of British Protestant descent that are on indigenous land in the United States. That's my culture. I come from a British Protestant background, missionary Baptist to be perfectly exact. And the construction of gender roles that I grew up with from my parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, our church community, the larger Black community in the South, those come out of the church, out of our understandings of respectability, how a woman should behave, being a lady, taking care of the household, maintaining her marriage, keeping her man happy, how the man should be the head of household, how he should work, be the breadwinner, be the provider. control his wife and children. That comes out of British colonialism and the British Protestant idea of what a family was and how the man was supposed to control his family. And that's something that enslaved Africans picked up from the slave master. That is what we internalized because our kinship systems, our family systems of extended family from West Africa, if you look historically at those ethnic groups in West Africa, Igbo, Yoruba, Ashanti, Mende peoples, Akan peoples, they have very different forms of social organization than what we have in the United States, which again, our understanding of gender and family comes from the British. And so when the British and other European powers, European colonizers and enslavers encountered African kinship systems, again, it's pathologized as abnormal, just like African religion and African culture, African cuisine was pathologized as abnormal. And the way a lot of time that in some kinship systems, power and social organization and leadership is built around the leadership of women and mothers and grandmothers. And you see some of that vestige within the that legacy within the African American community today, where historically our kinship systems are very much based on matrilineal lineage and being raised by your mama, your grandmama, your aunties. So some of that survives, but because of anti-blackness and because of colonialism, our matrilineal kinship systems are pathologized as abnormal, as the woman ran the man off, because the woman couldn't keep a man because she was, the stereotypes about black women, too demanding or whatever, too controlling of the black man, and the black man can't be the man of the household. We grew up with this idea and how deeply cissexist it is and how deeply patriarchal it is. And so when we're talking about cissexism, transphobia, transmisogyny, homophobia, femphobia within the African American community, you have to understand it in that context of British colonialism, Christian supremacy, enslavement, and being forced to adapt to Eurocentric ideas of gender and family structure and power and male leadership within a family. You cannot understand African American cissexism without that knowledge. Also, what's very important, because when we're talking about femphobia, and particularly misogyny, transmisogyny, within black communities and black families, you got to think about how femininity in general is pathologized for both female assigned people and male assigned people. Femininity is pathologized, on black bodies. For female assigned people, whether we identify as cis women or non-binary people, our bodies, you think about Sarhay Bartman, who was the South African, what is now today South Africa. She was kidnapped by Dutch enslavers and brought to Europe and then paraded around in the Netherlands, in Britain, in France, and when she died, her remains were kept in a French museum, preserved as if they were, her body was preserved as a relic. And so this fascination with the black female assigned body, the buttocks, the breast, the uterus, and you also remember the context of slave masters sexually assaulting, raping black women, breeding black women so that slave masters, British and eventually American slave masters, could create more product, because Africans were products, create more slaves and build the master's wealth. And so there's a lot of trauma among black cis women and black feminine centered people in general, but particularly black cis women and black female assigned people around the so-called female body, meaning the female assigned body, the body that gives birth. And that kind of intergenerational trauma of sexual abuse, of being forced to breed, being pathologized for how you give birth and how you have children, how you raise children. And that extends to people on the trans feminine spectrum as well, transgender women, Also just in general in the United States, to this day, just the lack of understanding of how sexuality and gender work, the lack of understanding of the science of gender and sexuality, the science of how gender identity develops in utero, a lot of ignorance around chromosomes and hormones, but that's for another video. But when we think about trans femininity and how male assigned at birth femininity is policed, is criminalized, that also comes out of colonialism. That comes out of the idea that when, the phenomenon of when Europeans, starting with the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French, when they encountered, male assigned, feminine centered people, among Africans, among Asians, among indigenous people here in the Americas, that was used to pathologize and then justify crimes of genocide against people of color, indigenous people in the Americas, and Africans and Asians around the world. And so that's where transmisogyny and femphobia and deeply homophobic, femphobic attitudes toward even cisgender men who are feminine, femicenter come from. And that comes out of colonialism as well. And we have to think about how a lot of times, the people that we today would call trans women, or male assigned femmes, feminine of center people, a lot of times in our ancestors' cultures, they were the priests, they were revered as goddesses, as life givers, as healers. But again, when the European colonizers, encountered them, this was something to be pathologized. Oh my God, these people are male assigned at birth, but they're feminine. Like what's up with that? These savages, these natives, whether we were African or indigenous American or Asian, that was used to pathologize and criminalize our people and enslave our people and to take over our lands. It was the colonizers used that as justification. So you have to understand the whole makings of transmisogyny and femphobia in that context in the modern world today. And in our day, 2015 going into 2016, European colonialism shapes most of the world. The British alone colonized 2/3 of the world. So, the British Empire was, huge all the way from here in the Americas to the Indian subcontinent to a lot of Africa, to also, a lot of Asian countries and countries in the Pacific, including, including South America, Guyana, when you look at Guyana, and then the Caribbean. So the British were everywhere. And so British ideas of patriarchy, of masculinity, of, the supremacy of Protestant religion, bringing the Bible to people around the world, you cannot separate our modern understanding of gender from that colonial missionary enslaving context. And so when we bring this back to African Americans in the present day, you look at the fact that Black trans women in the United States as of 2015, trans women of color in general, but in particular Black and Latina trans women in this country, who are the daughters, the great-granddaughters of both British and Spanish colonialism here in the Americas. Black and Latina women, being murdered, and because our people are hoodwinked, as Malcolm X said, our people, Black and Latino in the United States, are hoodwinked. They've been bamboozled. They've been led astray. They've been, they fell for the okie doke of the colonizer. That the trans woman is abnormal and that, she must be controlled. She must be eliminated from our community. A lot of cisgender men, in general, also the ignorance around sexuality, a lot of cisgender men are attracted to trans women, but because our society pathologizes cis male attraction for trans women, the cis men take that out on trans women. And instead of, being in solidarity with trans women who are harmed by male violence, cis cis women, and I'm speaking specifically of black cis women within the African American community, resent trans women for so-called taking our men and fooling men as if men do not choose trans women, do not pursue trans women. And that has to be talked about. That kind of, again, like most oppressed people who don't understand how the system works, black cis women have taken out their frustration, their anger at being oppressed, their anger at being objectified, at being marginalized, at being invisibilized by this society. They've taken it out on trans women's bodies. They've taken their resentment out on trans women instead of instead of studying their history and studying the history of black women in the United States and studying British colonialism and understanding the struggle of the African American woman. Instead of doing that internal work, that historical work, black cis women have taken out their frustration on black trans women who are suffering with colonial patriarchy just like they are. And so I feel like as an LGBTQ activist, particularly as a female assigned non-binary person who benefits from cis privilege, who benefits from female assigned at birth privilege, I really see it as part of my responsibility not only to combat my own trans misogyny, my own femphobia, but to challenge other female assigned people, cis women and non-binary female assigned people, transgender men as well, to hold us accountable for our trans misogyny. And I do that not only in solidarity with trans women and also as in a desire to be accountable to black trans women in my community, but also to combat this legacy of violence, this legacy of trauma against the black body in the United States and across the entire African diaspora, to combat the legacy that the British colonizer left us with in terms of violent, masculinity, violent patriarchy, rape culture. That is my way of exercising those demons. Because those demons are within me too. It's not, it's not just, the colonizer did this, the American state does that, the police does this, social workers do that. That violence is within me. It's within YM. And I carry that legacy of violence. From my mother, my grandmothers, my forefathers. And I see it as part of my responsibility to unpack how I've internalized patriarchy, how I've internalized trans misogyny, how I have internalized cissexism and femphobia, to combat those demons within myself, and to reach out to feminist-centered black people across the diaspora, but in particular, transgender women within the African American community. I see that as my work. And I want to join with other, black gender justice leaders, whether you're an LGBTQ activist like myself, a black feminist, black womanist, if you're a black man, a black cisgender man in solidarity with the liberation of black women and black LGBTQ people, I would love to join with you. And how can we put our heads together? If we could figure out how to combat cissexism and heteropatriarchy within the black community in our, in the United States, but also across the entire African diaspora, how can we do this work? Also, trans women, please feel free to call me out. Feel free to hold me accountable for what I am doing and how I am trying to combat trans misogyny and how I am trying to approach cisgender women and other female assigned at birth people about our problem with trans misogyny and femphobia. If any advice that you could give, just let me know what, how you think I'm doing on this work, because it's not enough for me to say, well, I want to fight trans misogyny. I have to be accountable to my community. I have to be accountable to trans women in my community about how I do this work. So I definitely want to hear from you on that. So just again, we want to black people, we want to figure out how to come together. How can we deal with our legacy of trauma? Post-traumatic slave syndrome, as Joy DeGrasse says, post-traumatic slave syndrome. And cissexism and transmisogyny and heteropatriarchy are part of that legacy of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Thank you.